Forget everything you know about the American West. Forget the dusty cowboys and the silent deserts. This is a story about blood, God, and $200 billion in gold that disappeared into the heart of an impossible mountain range, a fortune still waiting to be claimed. In the mid-1930s, at the height of the Great Depression, a small, unassuming man named Adolf Ruth drove his rickety Model A Ford from Washington, D.C. to the scorched earth of Arizona. He was an educated man, a former government clerk, who carried in his worn satchel not a map, but a single, brittle Spanish land grant written on sheepskin. Ruth was not looking for a new life. He was looking for a secret his family had held for over 80 years, the location of the Peralta gold, a treasure so vast it could have bankrolled a nation. On a blisteringly hot afternoon in June 1931, Ruth walked alone into the Superstition Mountains, a jagged, menacing wall of volcanic rock east of Phoenix. Locals called it the Mountain of Thunder, a place steeped in Apache warnings and settler folklore. Ruth had ignored every frantic plea to turn back, convinced that the cryptic markings on the sheepskin scroll would lead him to the motherlode. 6 weeks later, his skeletal remains were found scattered, his skull fractured. The old Spanish document? It was gone. Before he died, however, Ruth managed to scrawl a final, desperate note on the back of his pay stub, a chilling message that remains the only physical evidence of his journey's end. Vini, Vidi, Vici. $2 million worth of gold was in sight. But who stopped him? Was it the vengeful spirit of the mountains? Was it a greedy fellow prospector? Or was it the man whose name is now inextricably linked to the legend? The Dutchman, Jacob Waltz, a man who decades earlier had promised to take his secret to the grave, and perhaps did. This is not just a tale of lost gold. It is the untold history of how a massive Mexican fortune became the ghost at the feast of American expansion, fueling an enduring mystery that continues to kill those who seek the truth. The Empire of Choice, 1846 to 1848. The Peralta dynasty. To understand the lost Dutchman mine, one must first understand the Peralta family. They were not mere prospectors. They were Spanish-Mexican aristocracy, a land-rich dynasty whose roots in the Southwest predated the United States by over a century. The Peraltas, specifically Don Miguel Peralta de la Cordoba, held a massive land grant, the Peralta Grant, given by the Spanish crown. This grant covered millions of acres, a staggering territory that stretched from what is now central Arizona deep into New Mexico. Crucially, the Peraltas did not just own land, they owned the subsurface mineral rights to one of the richest yet most volatile regions in North America. Their wealth came from silver and copper, but their true obsession was gold. The Superstition Mountains, or as the Peraltas knew them, the Sierra de la Espuma, were their private bank. They operated a complex, almost industrial-scale gold mining operation long before the 1849 California gold rush captivated the American imagination. They used indigenous laborers, including some Apache, under harsh contracts, extracting a colossal fortune. The gold was smelted on site into small oblong bars called torta bars and periodically transported south to Mexico. This massive wealth was built on a dangerous bargain. The Peraltas occupied and extracted wealth from the ancestral lands of the Apache people. The Apache, particularly the Tonto Apache and the Pima, considered the Superstitions to be a sacred sanctuary, the home of their thunder god, Touché. They watched the Spanish-Mexican invaders defile their holy ground, digging up the precious yellow metal. The resentment was a ticking clock. The border is drawn in blood. The world of the Peraltas began to collapse not from Apache arrows, but from a diplomatic act thousands of miles away. In 1846, the Mexican-American War erupted. The United States, driven by the doctrine of manifest destiny, the belief that America was divinely ordained to stretch from coast to coast, waged war to seize the Western territories. The war concluded in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This treaty was one of the most consequential documents in American history. Mexico ceded vast territories, including what would become Arizona, California, New Mexico, Utah, and Nevada. Overnight, the Peraltas' ancestral lands became American territory. For the Peraltas, this was an existential crisis. The family, led by Don Pedro Peralta, now found themselves stranded behind a new arbitrary border. They only had a few years to solidify their claims or risk losing everything to American law. Don Pedro knew he had to retrieve the massive cache of gold bars they had extracted and stored deep within the Superstition Mountains before the American surveyors and soldiers arrived. He planned a final, desperate expedition north. The challenge was monumental. The Superstitions were now a war zone in miniature, a place where retreating Mexican troops, advancing American scouts, and furious Apache warriors all clashed. The massacre of the Arashtra. In the late summer of 1848, Don Pedro Peralta led an expedition of approximately 100 men, miners, mule handlers, and armed guards, into the heart of the Superstitions. Their goal? To load dozens of mules with the thousands of gold torta bars, estimated to be worth over $62 million in 1848 currency, translating to hundreds of billions today given the scale and quality. The expedition reached the secret mine site, a high, secluded plateau marked by several arastras, primitive stone mills used for crushing ore. They retrieved the gold. The weight of the fortune was staggering. Their mule train was long, slow, and defenseless. The Apache had been waiting. According to the few fragmented accounts that survived, the Apache warriors, led by a fierce younger chieftain, launched a swift and brutal attack. They knew the terrain intimately. The Peraltas were trapped in the narrow canyons and high washes. It was less a battle and more an execution. Every single member of the Peralta expedition was killed. The mule handlers were shot or speared, the mules scattered, and Don Pedro Peralta himself was found decapitated near a massive, distinctive rock formation, a landmark that would later be referred to as the Peralta Stone Marker. The Apache had won back their sacred land, but they had no use for the heavy, cursed yellow metal. The gold bars, loaded onto the mules, were abandoned. The fortune, the result of decades of Spanish-Mexican toil and blood, was simply swallowed by the mountain. The massacre of the Arashtra did three things that cemented the legend. One, it created an immense, verified historical gold cache that was officially recorded as lost on both Mexican and early U.S. land registries. Two, it consecrated the Superstitions as a place of violence and death, reinforcing the Apache's curse on those who sought the gold. Three, crucially, it left behind the Peralta maps and land grants. The documents, carried by Don Pedro, did not perish with him. They were carried south by an unknown survivor or perhaps recovered by a relative, ensuring that the knowledge of the mine's exact location, the $2 million in sight, would live on. The shadow of manifest destiny. The 1850s were a period of tumultuous transition in the Arizona Territory. American prospectors poured in, driven by the siren call of gold and silver. The Peralta massacre was whispered about in saloons and mining camps, a cautionary tale that only fueled the reckless ambition of the new arrivals. The vast, unmapped, and deadly Superstition Mountains became the ultimate prize. The United States government, eager to establish control over its new acquisition, found itself constantly battling the Apache, who resisted the intrusion fiercely. Federal troops were deployed, but the sheer scale of the wilderness, combined with the Apache's masterful guerrilla tactics, made colonization a slow and bloody affair. Into this violent, chaotic environment arrived Jacob Waltz. Waltz was a German immigrant, and thus mistakenly called the Dutchman, Deutsch being mistaken for Dutch by English speakers. He was born around 1810 in the German state of Württemberg and emigrated to the U.S. during the mid-19th century. Unlike the romanticized figures of the Wild West, Waltz was described as a shrewd, solitary, and often temperamental man, a true professional prospector, not a settler. He had cut his teeth during the California gold rush, learning the trade through hard labor and sharper observation. By 1863, Waltz was operating near the burgeoning American settlement of Phoenix, often prospecting along the Salt River. He was poor, like most prospectors, until he suddenly wasn't. The deadly partnership. Jacob Waltz's sudden, unexplained affluence began around 1868. He started making regular, small purchases in Phoenix, often paying in high-grade, unrefined gold quartz, the purest kind, identical to the type found in the Peralta Arashtras. Where was this gold coming from? Waltz always claimed he had struck a good vein miles away, offering deliberately vague descriptions. The true story, according to multiple conflicting accounts, involves a deadly, secret alliance. Sometime between 1864 and 1868, Waltz and his partner Jacob Weiser, also likely German, met a descendant of the Peralta family, possibly a man named Miguel Peralta IV, who had escaped the 1848 massacre or retrieved the crucial documents. This relative, desperately poor and unable to mount his own heavily armed expedition, allegedly possessed the Peralta map and the accompanying Spanish mining grant. A deal was struck. The Peraltas would reveal the map and the location of the lost cache, a site they could no longer safely access, in exchange for a large percentage of the retrieved gold. It was a Faustian bargain. The Peralta family received their map back. The gold seekers paid with their lives or souls. Waltz and Weiser, guided by the map, finally located the legendary mine deep within the most dangerous section of the Superstitions. What they found was not just a vein, it was a rich pocket of free milling gold, ore that could be crushed and processed quickly, requiring minimal labor. More incredibly, they found the 1848 cache, hundreds of the abandoned Peralta torta bars. The gold was literally lying in sight, just as Adolf Ruth would later discover. The mountain takes its toll. The two Jacobs mined in secret, making several successful clandestine trips back and forth, bringing out small but continuous amounts of gold. They quickly amassed a private fortune, but the partnership was fragile, built on greed and fear. The mountain's curse, or perhaps human nature, struck. One story says Weiser became greedy and attempted to ambush Waltz. Another suggests they were attacked by Apache warriors, but Waltz escaped and left the wounded Weiser to die. A third, more chilling version, claims that Waltz, fearing Weiser might reveal the secret location in a drunken fit or through blackmail, murdered his partner in cold blood near the mine entrance. The historical evidence is ambiguous, but the outcome is clear. Jacob Weiser disappeared. From that point forward, Jacob Waltz operated alone, burdened by his secret and the knowledge of his partner's probable fate. He visited the mine only a few times in the remaining years, each trip a high-risk venture. the Superstition Mountains became his dark kingdom, the source of his wealth and his terror. The legacy of the Dutchman. By the 1870s, Jacob Waltz was living openly in Phoenix, a successful, if eccentric, rancher. He never became ostentatiously rich. He spent his money slowly, carefully. He never married. His most trusted confidant was a woman named Julia Thomas, a German immigrant who ran a successful bakery in Phoenix. As Waltz aged, and sensing his time was short, he began to drop cryptic clues about his mind to Julia, almost as if the secret was physically burning him. He spoke of landmarks, the Weeping Woman rock formation, the mine that could only be found by looking down into a heart-shaped canyon, the mine entrance marked by the shadow of the sleeping Mexican, the stone arrow pointing to the gold. These fragments of information were the beginning of the Lost Dutchman mine legend. The name stuck, the Lost Dutchman. Waltz died in 1891, not from an Apache arrow or a fellow prospector's bullet, but from complications related to the Great Phoenix Flood that year. Julia was at his bedside. His final feverish words to her were not a clear direction, but a haunting guarantee. "Julia, I will tell you where it is, but you must promise to—" He trailed off, dying before the sentence was finished. The only solid evidence Julia recovered from his cabin were several sacks containing over $3,000 in pure gold ore, enough to prove the story was true, but not enough to fund a proper search. The Dutchman had taken the exact location of the Peralta gold to his grave, leaving behind only tantalizing, often contradictory clues that ensured the mountain would never know peace. The birth of a modern myth. Following Jacob Waltz's death in 1891, the legend of the Lost Dutchman mine transformed from a local prospector's secret into an international sensation. Julia Thomas, lacking funds and precise instructions, sold her possessions, including the gold ore and the vague clues, to Colonel James Addison Rivas, a notorious land swindler who had previously attempted to claim millions of acres in Arizona using forged Spanish documents. Rivas quickly faded from the story, confirming that the map's power was only for those who truly understood the superstitions. By the turn of the century, the Superstition Mountains became a magnet for every desperate, dreaming soul in the American West. Newspapers romanticized the story, turning Waltz into a romantic, tragic hero, and the Peraltas into mysterious, doomed conquistadors. The legend was no longer just about finding gold. It became a symbol of the last great American opportunity, a chance to strike it rich without conforming to the new industrial economy. The gold that Waltz had spent gradually entered the American financial system. Its provenance was often questioned, but the quality of the ore, which geologists confirmed was unlike most other known deposits in the territory, lent credence to the idea of a massive, hidden vein. The Arizona State Park and the Apache Plea. As Arizona moved toward statehood in 1912, civic leaders and early conservationists began to recognize the Superstition Mountains not just as a potential source of wealth, but as a critical piece of the state's natural and cultural heritage. The superstitions were finally protected. But this act complicated the search immensely. The Apache people, marginalized and often confined to reservations, watched the feverish search with dark amusement and mounting frustration. For them, the mountain remained sacred and cursed. Several Apache elders made public, if ignored, statements warning searchers. They asserted that the mountain had a spirit, and that only those with a clean heart, not those driven by greed, would survive. Their repeated counsel, "The yellow metal belongs to the mountain. Those who take it will belong to the mountain." FDR, Executive Order 6102, and the gold confiscation.
The biggest historical turning point for the lost Dutchman gold came not from a prospector's shovel, but from a president's pen. The Great Depression hit the United States hard in the 1930s. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, sought radical solutions to stabilize the reeling economy. One of his most controversial actions was directly tied to the very wealth being sought in the superstitions: the control of privately held gold. On April 5, 1933, FDR signed Executive Order 6102. This order effectively outlawed the private possession of gold coins, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. Citizens were required to deliver their gold to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper money. The goal was to devalue the dollar relative to gold, stabilize the banking system, and allow the government to inflate the currency, a crucial move for the New Deal policies. The implication for the lost Dutchman gold was massive. Legal status. If the Peralta gold, that massive cache of torta bars, were found, it would immediately become the property of the U.S. government under the provisions of the executive order. It was no longer a personal fortune, it was a national asset. Secrecy. Any prospector who found the mine after 1933 would have a monumental choice: declare the find and lose control of the wealth, or keep it a profound secret and risk federal prosecution for hoarding gold, which carried severe penalties. This historical context provides the chilling backdrop for the return of the man mentioned in the hook, Adolf Ruth, the second coming of the Peralta map. Adolf Ruth, the man who died in the superstitions in 1931, was driven by more than just the pursuit of wealth. He was driven by family honor. Ruth's son, Erwin Ruth, was married to a member of the Peralta family lineage, one of the descendants who had carried the original documents and oral history of the mine. The family's belief was that the Peralta gold was the only true inheritance left to them, and they needed to reclaim it before the American government could stake a definitive claim. Ruth's mission was therefore twofold: to prove the existence of the gold and to establish the Peralta family's historical ownership. The key was the brittle sheepskin document, the Peralta land grant and map. In the summer of 1931, armed with the map and an almost desperate conviction, Ruth entered the mountains. The map, unlike the vague clues left by Waltz, likely contained precise Spanish-era survey markers. He knew he was looking for the original 1848 Arashtra site, the scene of the massacre. He found it. His final scrawled note, Veni, Vidi, Vici, $20,000 in sight, suggests he not only located the mine entrance, but saw the gold cache itself. The mine was in sight. But then came the ending: a fractured skull, scattered remains, and the disappearance of the priceless Spanish document. The prevailing theory among investigators and historians is that Ruth was murdered. But by whom? A jealous prospector? The Depression had made men desperate. Ruth, an outsider, may have been followed and ambushed the moment he located the mine. A government agent? Less likely, but plausible. Did the nascent federal efforts to control gold lead an operative to silence a man who possessed the key to a national fortune? The Apache. Had the guardians of the mountain enacted their final tragic curse on the latest trespasser? The truth remains obscured, but Adolf Ruth's death ensured one thing: the legend was not a myth, it was a verifiable fact, protected by a continuous streak of violence stretching from 1848 to 1931. The gold was real, and the mountain was deadly.
The Desert Secrets in the Atomic Age. The death of Adolf Ruth and the confirmation that the Peralta gold was a verifiable historical fact intensified the search during the post-World War II era. This was a new age of prospecting, replacing the mules and picks with jeeps, radio equipment, and eventually aerial reconnaissance. The Superstition Mountains became a testing ground for early geophysical prospecting techniques. Teams from universities and private companies, often operating under the guise of general geological surveys, began using magnetometers, Geiger counters, to detect naturally radioactive elements often associated with gold deposits, and even early forms of radar to penetrate the deep volcanic rock. The challenge was unprecedented. The superstitions are not a simple granite dome. They are a complex, fractured mess of volcanic tuff, basalt, and andesite. The constant shifting of the Earth, coupled with intense erosion, meant that any surface markers described by Waltz or the Peralta maps could have been obliterated or changed beyond recognition. The legend gained a new, darker layer during this period: the involvement of the U.S. military. The military and the $200 billion question. During the Cold War, the U.S. government became intensely interested in securing domestic sources of strategic minerals. While gold was no longer the sole basis for currency, the gold standard was eroding. Vast amounts of gold bullion were still crucial for international trade and national reserves. Rumors persisted that a covert military unit or a specialized geological survey team had finally located the Peralta gold in the 1960s or 70s. The theory goes like this: the military, needing an accessible, massive reserve, used advanced mapping technology, perhaps classified satellite imagery or high-resolution LiDAR, to pinpoint the exact location. Why the secrecy? Because the gold could not be removed publicly. 1. Market stability. Introducing hundreds of billions of dollars worth of gold onto the open market would instantly destabilize global commodity prices and potentially crash the value of existing gold reserves held by the Federal Reserve. 2. Legal tangle. A public discovery would trigger a monumental legal battle involving the U.S. government, under Executive Order 6102, the state of Arizona as the landowner, the Peralta descendants, armed with the original Spanish grants, and the Apache Nation, who could claim cultural and ancestral ownership. The most compelling circumstantial evidence for a government discovery lies in the fact that throughout the 1970s and 80s, the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management dramatically increased security and land management protocols in the deepest, most inaccessible canyons of the superstitions. Certain areas became restricted due to unstable rock formations or environmental testing, areas which coincidentally aligned with the general clues of the Dutchman's mine. The result is the popular conspiracy theory that the Peralta gold is not lost at all, but merely secured, a vast, secret national treasure hidden in plain sight, its entrance carefully camouflaged and monitored. The archaeology of blood. Beyond the tales of violence and prospectors' ambition, the legend of the Lost Dutchman mine holds a critical place in the archaeology of American expansion. Historians and cultural anthropologists argue that the greatest value of the superstition mystery is not the gold itself, but the undeniable proof it offers of the scale of pre-American mineral extraction in the Southwest. The Peralta dynasty's operation was not small-scale. It was a sophisticated, decades-long industrial project. The massacre of the Arashtra in 1848 serves as a brutal counter-narrative to Manifest Destiny. It was the moment when the land, embodied by the fiercely resistant Apache, rejected the greed of the colonizers, both Spanish-Mexican and American. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a noted historian of the American West, argued compellingly in her 1990 book, The Price of Empire, that the Dutchman legend is a cultural mechanism designed to justify American entitlement. We don't call it the Peralta Massacre, we call it the Lost Dutchman. We've erased the Spanish-Mexican history and the Apache resistance, replacing it with a simple European immigrants puzzle. It shifts the blame for the violence away from American expansion and places it on a lone, quirky German prospector. The story we tell ourselves is simple. The truth,
A tale of genocide, stolen land, and centuries of extraction is too complex and painful. The few surviving Peralta documents and the forensic evidence from the Ruth case confirm the existence of the gold. The legend confirms the American desire to simplify a complex, bloody history. The mountain endures. Today, the superstition wilderness remains a protected, dangerous place. The Arizona State Legislature has passed strict laws regarding the excavation of historical sites, making the search for the mine legally perilous before considering the federal gold hoarding laws. Hundreds of people have gone missing or died in the superstitions over the last century, giving credence to the Apache curse. Some were prospectors, others were tourists ill-equipped for the brutal desert, and some, like Adolf Ruth, died violently near the very goal they sought. The mountain remains a silent, indifferent witness to the human cost of greed. The estimated $200 billion in gold remains a ghost, a historical fact, a national asset, and a cultural obsession. It is not just the richest lost treasure in American history, it is a metallic symbol of the violent birth of the American Southwest, a testament to the price paid for empire, and a chilling reminder that the deadliest secret is the one that refuses to stay buried. The only certain conclusion is this: the gold is still there, waiting for the person brave or foolish enough to face the devil's bargain of the Mountain of Thunder. Thanks for watching our video. Subscribe our channel for more updates.